Good evening, everyone. This is Radio Free Mormon. That's Bill Reel, and this is Mormonism Live. Really excited for tonight's show. It's Book of Mormon DNA, like we've never seen it before. And by that, I mean in a format that I can understand. And it took a great professor, a professor of anthropology, to be able to say it in such a way that even I could understand it. And we're lucky enough to have him as a guest tonight with us on the show. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me Professor Thomas W. Murphy.
Hello.
Good evening.
It's great to be here from Seahawk territory in the Seattle area.
Isn't it? Yes, two out of the three of us are in Seahawk territory. One of us is in perpetual brown mode.
Cleveland Browns. Yeah, it's sad over here on this side of the country.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
I
was
understand
quite
they have some good teams over there too.
What's that?
I understand they have some good teams over there too.
Well, I mean, New England, if you keep going, Detroit Lions.
You could pick something else. I'm just saying.
Yeah. There's better teams than the Browns, that's for sure.
Well, this is getting us off to a rollicking start, at least with football fans. But Professor Murphy, anyway, will give us a secret sign of the Seahawks right there. And we want to talk with you tonight, especially about DNA in the Book of Mormon, and specifically to give you the chance to respond to some scurrilous statements by Stephen B. Smoot, especially in a recent podcast titled, it's the Uninformed Saints podcast. 3 uninformed saints get together and show how uninformed they are. And one of them, Stephen B. Smoot. And the other two are the Rapleys, Jasmine Sans E, and Neil Rapley, I believe it is. And they're all three there showing how uninformed they are. But it was in this context, and I think it was just a week ago, within the week, right, that at the very end, it's like young Smoot went totally off script and just started going after you by name and saying things about you that you would like to take issue with tonight. Is that correct?
Yes, I would like to respond and make some corrections, but also there's some things I liked about the show too. So we'll talk about that too.
Really? Okay. That'll be nice of you. Let me see if I can put this up here. This is the title slide tonight. I am not responsible for this slide, except that I'm the one who put in parentheses, DNA erasure. Can you explain for us, Professor, what the heck that title means above the parentheses?
Yes, I came up with the term DNerAsure to describe DNA erasure, the erasure of indigenous DNA in the discourse about the Book of Mormon coming from apologetics. And what the case I'm going to make today is that this is a classic example of the way that settler colonists have erased indigenous perspectives in the creation of the Book of Mormon to begin with. And then in discussions of DNA, they actually are erasing the actual indigenous DNA, telling Native Americans that they cannot trust their own DNA to contain their own history. And I'm going to counter that. I'm going to argue that the science is not settled, neither is the scripture. This will put, the next slide is, I guess, for you. So
this is for me. This is for me to say nice things about you, Dr. Thomas W. Murphy, who has apparently a PhD. Correct me if I get anything wrong on this, will you?
Sure.
Has a PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington, hence the sweatshirt and beanie. He is past president of the Mormon Social Science Association and has conducted anthropological fieldwork in both Mesoamerica and the Heartland. He is the author of Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois, and the Book of Mormon, and dozens of peer-reviewed articles on indigeneity and Mormonism. His articles have won Best Theology and Scripture Writing Awards from Dialogue Foundation and the John Whitmer Historical Association. His latest article on DNA and the Book of Mormon won the May West. Mayberry. Sorry, there's a little
Mayberry.
thing. The number thing is right in front of that word. Won the
Yeah.
Mayberry Best Indigenous Studies Award from the Mormon History Association. So, wow, that's quite impressive.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction.
You are welcome.
What I want to do in today's presentation is make a connection between my earlier work that was 25 years ago on DNA and the Book of Mormon with my current work on a new book that I have coming out from the University of Utah Press this spring. It's entitled Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. University of Utah Press is making available to listeners at Mormonism Live a 25% discount. If you follow the QR code on the screen, it'll take you directly to the University of Utah Press, this website for the book. You can enter the discount Murphy25 and get 25% off your pre-orders. This discount code will be good through the end of April. So if you hear this, if you're not hearing this live, you still have an opportunity to pursue that discount.
Did you
I'm
say
also
when
gonna, go
did you say
ahead.
when it will be available?
It's going to be coming out in May, and it will be. I will be at the Mormon History Association in June in Las Vegas, where I will be autographing copies of the book. So I'd encourage listeners to stop by, say hi, and I'll be happy to sign your book.
Fantastic. Wonderful.
I also have made available a kind of a preview, if you will, of the book in an article that just appeared in Dialogue in winter 2025. The article is titled White as a Night, the Book of Mormon's Misappropriation of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. And this article looks at the way that Haudenosaunee or Iroquois traditional stories have been co-opted, misappropriated in the Book of Mormon, and used as tools of settler colonial racism that we'll talk a little bit more about as we go on in today's presentation. So if you want a preview of what the book is about, you can download that for free from the Dialogue website. I
did that and I read it yesterday. It's very interesting.
I'm excited about it.
This is the idea, not that Joseph Smith exclusively got ideas that he incorporated into Mormonism from other people in his society and neighborhood who were white, but that also he may have gotten some things which you are identifying from the local Native Americans and their story. And that shows up in the Book of Mormon.
And I've made today's slideshow available on my academia website. You can see the URL address for it on the slide. If you go to that site and click on the link, you'll see a link with a sharing of this slideshow. You can follow the slideshow throughout the presentation. And then within the slideshow, I have made all of the images, such as the image here of the Dialogue article. They're active links. So if you click on them, you can follow them to the articles and materials that I discuss. So that's to help those who want to dig deeper, who want to hear more than just the live presentation, but want to investigate things I say or that others have said on their own.
Great idea. Thank you for allowing us to do that.
Now, the kind of an overview of what I have planned today is that we're going to show a clip from Informed Saints at the beginning. I want to thank Brent Metcalf for bringing this to my attention. He shared it with me right after it came out. And I'd already scheduled with RFM and Bill Reel that I would be on the show today. And the original plan was to talk more exclusively about my book and article. But I thought, you know what, this is a great way actually to frame a presentation of my book and article by discussing and correcting some of the misrepresentations of my work in Informed Saints. So we're going to ask, did they give an accurate summary of scholarship on DNA in the Book of Mormon, and particularly on mine? I also will review the weaknesses and the strengths of Butler and Perrego's Let's talk about misconceptions with DNA in the Book of Mormon. That is the topic of their show, is this particular book. And I have carefully read it before I saw their show, and have a few things to say about it as well. And so we'll discuss, how does all this connect to my new article, White as a Night, and my book, Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. And then we'll end tonight by opening the studio for your calls.
All right. Well, it sounds like a plan. This is my favorite part because I get to see my hero, Stephen B. Smoot.
Yeah. Well, let's see what he has to say about this Dr. Thomas Murphy.
We've been talking about the misconceptions people have about DNA, but with all of this in mind, does DNA disprove the Book of Mormon?
Well, I would say humbly no. Based on my reading, again, and probably Ugo's going to watch this episode, and he's going to be cringing so hard at our misuse of scientific terms.
We're trying our best,
Ugo,
if we're trying our best poorly.
So please, to our listeners and our viewers, defer to the published literature, both this and others that we're going to say for the very technical and accurate scientific terminology and explanation. We're doing our best to sort of give our input on it. But to answer your question, Jasmine, no, I don't think that DNA disproves the Book of Mormon. I think what DNA does do is it shows that certain theories about Book of Mormon geography and certain interpretations and hermeneutical approaches to the Book of Mormon are deeply problematic, if not falsified, with DNA, right? But that's a separate question. So if you're going to posit a hemispheric geography and an empty continent when Lehi arrives here, DNA kind of nukes that from orbit, honestly. You know what I mean? But if you are like myself and Neil and you, Jasmine, if you are inclined to accept a limited geography where Lehi and his family are colonizers in a very heavily populated ancient America where there's lots of other people already here, and that pretty quickly they're integrating into these pre-existing indigenous populations, right? Then DNA is defanged considerably in terms of being used to disprove the Book of Mormon. So I honestly, when I read critics today using this, at least the informed ones, they've kind of moved away from DNA because they kind of recognize this, and it's more towards, well, but the Book of Mormon doesn't say that. The Book of Mormon doesn't teach a limited geography. Mm-hmm. I remember when the first round of responses came out to this, right? So Thomas Murphy published his article in like 2002, 2001 on Lamanite Genesis and genetics. He called it a Galileo event for Mormons or Latter-day Saints, right? And the response was very swift from Latter-day Saint believing scientists to explain what we've explained here. And like Thomas Murphy's next sort of round of response was, oh, but limited geography is not in the Book of Mormon. It's a hemispheric geography. Well, now you're not doing science, dude. Now you're doing interpretation. And now Thomas Murphy's most recent thing is, well, you know, the Book of Mormon is also like super racist and how it talks about indigenous peoples. That's not a scientific argument. Now you're making like moral and theological and textual arguments, right? So I think that we've kind of, if I may say, the science of it seems pretty settled, not in the sense of we can't learn new things, but in the sense of like we have a pretty firm picture of how this works from the data that we have. We're now, it's not a question of what's the DNA as opposed to like, how does this account for specific interpretations of the Book of Mormon? Some of them are consistent with DNA. Some of them are not consistent with DNA. Others just aren't relevant to DNA. So it's getting more kind of in that area, I would say. I don't know, Neil, do you think I'm on the right track here?
I mean, I do think the conversation shifted very quickly to, how you interpret the Book of Mormon. That's absolutely true, both with Thomas Murphy and Simon Southerton, really. Who was the other geneticist in the early 2000s who, I say other, he's the one who's a geneticist. Thomas Murphy was an anthropologist,
I think. Yeah.
It did move. And that's really where the conversation is. When someone brings up DNA, they're packing into that a bunch of assumptions about how it's read. And we're going to get people in our comments who disagree with, our interpretation. And,
that's fine if you want to, but that's not a scientific question. That's a question of hermeneutics and textual interpretation.
That's kind of the point, though, is like we're not really arguing over the science anymore. We're arguing over how you interpret the Book of Mormon. And
well.
And if you'll mute that again, Thomas.
Yeah.
So can you unpack that for our audience, Tom, and help us understand what it is that they're saying? I mean, let me do that first, okay? Because I know you're going to contradict it, right? So let me at least try and explain what it is they're saying.
Sure.
So the audience can understand it. Okay. By the way, it is rich, though. We did even catch at the very beginning of the clip them apologizing to Ugo, to the experts, because they don't know. They're not expert in the subject matter that they've been talking about throughout the entire podcast. But then when it comes to a guy named Thomas Murphy, you better stick to science, because you don't have a voice at the table to talk about something that you're not an expert in, Tom. That was rich, I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, but here's what they're doing. So the hemispheric model means Book of Mormon people from the Arctic Circle all the way down, okay, to the southernmost tip of South America. That's the hemispheric model. This is what Joseph Smith no doubt believed, and what a lot of people believed early on. But then because that's the most natural, right? There's a land northward, there's a land southward, and there's a narrow neck of land in the middle. It's obvious. The problem is that then it ended up being too big. And really, these journeys are becoming like really long. So they scrapped that and they started going, at least some people, I would say the basic rank and file Mormon out there today believes the hemispheric model. But when you start going into it, you start realizing that really it looks like a more limited geography. And that's the other expression they have, limited geography. So it's not hemispheric, it's limited. And roughly the size maybe depends on your model of Pennsylvania turned on its side and pinched in the middle, right? And then turned at this crazy angle. So it can be the isthmus of Tehuantepec. It's all crazy. But the limited part is what you need to know. So limited in Mesoamerica is one limited model, okay? But also limited in North America is another, and that's called the Heartland. So there's a Mesoamerican limited model and a Heartland limited model. Now, what they're saying, first off, they're conceding that there is zero DNA evidence to support Middle Eastern incursions into the Americas before Columbus.
Right.
And I have a clip of that at the end to demonstrate that that's what they're saying. Zero evidence. What they're trying to do is say, but if we make the Nephites small enough and shrink that target from the entire United States and Mexico and Mesoamerica and South America and Canada, all the way, if we shrink that target to so small that it's just a little drop of DNA coming into this massive civilization, all of which, by the way, if you haven't read the Book of Mormon has zero to say. If you read the Book of Mormon sounds like a relatively small group of people who end up going to a land, and they don't mention finding anybody there. All right? Just to be clear, there is zero record of their finding anybody. Although several hundred years later, however long it is, when they do run into another group of people, right? The people of Zarahemna, remember them?
Right. They were from Israel too.
Right. They mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
So we would expect that if they ran into people, they would mention them, just like they mentioned these other people, but zero. So they're just making stuff up at this point. That's what's important to understand. And what they're saying is the hemispheric model, okay, well, no DNA means no Middle Eastern DNA means nuked from space, right?
Yeah.
Because that would destroy the Book of Mormon. It would prove it wasn't true. So therefore, they're trying to make it as small as possible, a small incursion in this huge civilization. And what they're saying is, once they have stacked the deck sufficiently from top to bottom, DNA doesn't nuke the Book of Mormon from space anymore.
Both sides agree that the DNA isn't there.
Right.
One side says, yeah, of course it's not there. This is a myth story. The other side says, well, if you make some allowances and you allow this to happen and that to happen and DNA to slowly disappear and be absorbed, then maybe we just shouldn't expect it to be there. But both sides agree there is no Nephite or Lamanite DNA.
Yes. And I'm astonished at two things. The first thing is that they could go there, that anybody could go there. And the second thing I'm astonished at is that I used to be one of those people.
Well, 25 years ago, that's what I almost got excommunicated for. So
yes, you were on the show once and you talked about it. It was 25 years ago. You wrote the book. I know you and Simon Southerton were working at around the same time. You may have collaborated on a paper at least together, but about this idea that the DNA is now sufficiently developed in the Americas before Columbus that we can pretty confidently say that there's nothing in there from the Middle East. And that caused quite a hubbub.
Yeah, and my stake president called me in, asked me to change my conclusions, and I said I wouldn't unless the science changed. Well, the science hasn't changed, so I guess actually what happens, the church changed the introduction to the Book of Mormon. So where the Book of Mormon used to say the Lamanites are the principal ancestors of American Indians, it now says they are among the ancestors of American Indians. So the changes as far as DNA are concerned have been on the church's part, right? The church has actually surprisingly endorsed and validated, especially in this book, the conclusions that I made 25 years ago and that they almost excommunicated me for.
That's incredible. What a cave, Bill.
Can I say just one more thing, which is, if you go back in time and you find the exact moment when apologists said, you know what, we're going to need there to be other people here. That was because that was the solution that you come up with when the problems around the Book of Mormon got too big for them to solve maintaining the old status quo beliefs. So limited geography, I get. Book of Mormon trips, again, I think Joseph intended one thing, but he has people traveling those distances in a short amount of time. And so, of course, limited geography is going to have to be the way you have to go. But there's no way the Book of Mormon makes space for lots more people being here unless you just go, well, it doesn't say there isn't exactly. You're just playing word games. In the moment you said, we're going to need lots of other people here, was because you were coming up with a solution to a problem that you didn't like the answer to.
Yeah.
By the way, this is actually on the screen. That is the thumbnail that they created. The thumbnail says no DNA. That's what their show's about. This entire podcast is about why it is that zero DNA in support of the Book of Mormon doesn't completely tank it as scripture.
And RFM, did you want me to play that short before I move on?
I'm going to actually, that was all precatory to my saying this. Is it correct that the main thing that you disagree with and want to demonstrate that Stephen B. Smoot said is about you, and that you have said, well, wait a second, it's about the limited geography. Remember, general hemispheric nuked from space, but he believes, Stephen Smoot believes, that a limited geography can survive, and then he impugns you and says that you haven't even dealt with that issue. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's one concern that I have. The other concerns is the trajectory of how he describes my scholarship. As if I first was arguing about DNA, I shifted then to interpretations of the Book of Mormon, and then I shifted again to saying the Book of Mormon is racist. And actually what happened is in the reverse order. My scholarship first showed that the Book of Mormon was racist and dealt directly with hermeneutics or interpretations of the text from the very beginning. And only later did I actually write about DNA. And so I'm going to show that telling a little history of my publications.
Okay, great. So let's just play this again, because I think you'll be excited to know that even more people are seeing this and hearing what Stephen Smoot has to say about you. Because if we go over to the next slide, or if we put up the slide that we need, Bill.
I got it here.
Yeah, they made a YouTube short of it. So I want to make sure that we hear this again, these statements that Smoot makes about you before you begin to defend yourself.
I honestly, when I read critics today using this, at least the informed ones, they've kind of moved away from DNA because they kind of recognize this, and it's more towards, well, but the Book of Mormon doesn't say that. The Book of Mormon doesn't teach a limited geography. I remember when the first round of responses came out to this, right? So Thomas Murphy published his article in like 2002, 2001 on Lamanite genesis and genetics. He called it a Galileo event for Mormons or Latter-day Saints, right? And the response was very swift from Latter-day Saint believing scientists to explain what we've explained here. And like Thomas Murphy's next sort of round of response was, oh, but limited geography is not in the Book of Mormon. It's a hemispheric geography. Well, now you're not doing science, dude. Now you're doing interpretation. And now Thomas Murphy's most recent thing is, well, you know, the Book of Mormon is also like super racist and how it talks about indigenous peoples. That's not a scientific argument. Now you're making like moral and theological and textual arguments, right? I honestly, when I read critics today using this, at least the informed ones,
Yeah, I think that was the loop. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. By the way, Tom, was there some place in there that one of the uninformed saints suggested that they had a familiarity with your writings?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Both Stephen and Neil suggest their familiarity, and Neil, in fact, suggested he had read almost all of it. So we'll see about that. So if you can, Bill, if you can put that slideshow back up.
Let's do that. By the way, Dan Vogel's making a comment that limited geography is not science either. And that reminds me to say hi, because I'll bet that Brent Metcalf is watching.
Yeah. Hi, Dan. Hi, Brent. Dan and Brent, for people who don't know, my article that they mentioned, they almost got the title right. It's Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, appeared in a book edited by Dan Vogel and Brent Metcalf called American Apocrypha. And so shout out to Dan and Brent. So do they give an accurate summary? I will say that their acknowledgement that there is no support from DNA for the Book of Mormon is laudable. I appreciate Stephen identifying me as one of the informed ones. But the summary of my research is misleading. It's out of chronological order. I am going to argue that the science is not, in fact, settled. That is, that we do not entirely agree on the science. Neither is the scripture settled. We also disagree on the scripture. And I'm arguing that these scholars and podcasters are engaging in DNerAsure, or erasing indigenous voices and bodies, to uphold a racist settler colonial history in the Book of Mormon.
Can you give me just a little bit more on that last one, Thomas? It sounds fascinating, and describe a little bit more what you mean by that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So most people have heard of the term colonialism, right? So colonialism is when you have an empire, an empirical power that travels outside of their territory and creates a colony in someone else's territory and begin to extract resources, often killing people, exploitative. Sometimes it is less exploitative. Both can occur in the same places. And they exploit the resources and bring back and enrich the colony or the mother nation at the expense of the colony. That's called colonialism. There's a particular form of colonialism that we see in the United States and Canada and New Zealand and South Africa. And this colonialism is called settler colonialism, because the colonial powers do not only create a colony where they extract resources, they begin to appropriate the land itself. So settlers move from the home nation to the colony and establish their own state that is designed to replace the indigenous states and nations that are already there. And so that's essentially what happens in the United States. And the Book of Mormon, I would argue, is fundamentally a settler colonial text. It is a text that justifies the expropriation of land in the Americas by blaming indigenous people for the loss of land due to their own wickedness. And it ends up justifying then settler presence in places where they don't belong.
How do you see the three uninformed saints continuing that trend in their podcast?
Because so the settler colonial state, the way that it establishes its power is by genocide or the destruction of indigenous nations. That can include the killing of peoples, but it can also include just the destruction of the political power and absorbing the indigenous people into a new settler state in a kind of lower social status. So in the case of the Book of Mormon, what you have is the Book of Mormon presents a history that says, well, really the original settlers here were white to begin with. So the white people coming from Europe then have a sense of belonging in this place because they are like the originals. And actually, it's kind of contradictory because the Book of Mormon narrative has people coming from Israel, yet it presents them as if they were white. But that's the reason it does that is because it's mirroring 19th century settler society by creating this division between Lamanites and Nephites that replicates the division between the European settlers and the indigenous peoples of the 18th and 19th century. And so one of the ways that a settler state gains power is by erasing or wiping out the indigenous people. What they're doing here is they are erasing the DNA. They are making a case for, well, we can't trust DNA because indigenous DNA disappeared. That is a form of erasure.
So actually, of course, Native Americans do have their own DNA, which does not go to the Middle East.
Indeed.
But it goes where it goes, right?
Right.
And so what they're saying is your DNA doesn't really count because we're going to impose the Book of Mormon's view of DNA on yours and say that even though you don't have it now, you definitely had it some generations ago and you're still descendants.
And that you lost it.
Yes.
Right.
A lot of things get lost in Mormonism.
Yeah. So their show is based on a review of this book. Let's talk about misconceptions with DNA in the Book of Mormon. This is authored by a couple of geneticists, John Butler and Hugo Perego. So first, to consider the accuracy of their statements, let's consult this text and what this text actually says. On page 6, Butler and Perego write, learning from the past works best with a multidisciplinary approach involving perspectives from anthropology, archaeology, history, paleobotany, linguistics, climatology, sociology, social and cultural studies, etc. Learning from the past works best. So the best science is the science that also includes the hermeneutics. The best science is that also includes the archaeology. The best science is that includes linguistics and includes the cultural material. And so they acknowledge it in this book. But the interesting thing is they don't do it. And this is where I want to talk a little bit about how scientific publications work.
Yes, and can you also tell us how close you are to this book and its publication and pre-publication process?
Yeah. So in scientific publications, you have a peer review process. And what happens is an author submits to an editor. The editor may be of a book series or of a scientific journal. This is a book series by Deseret Book. So they have an editor. They present their material to the editor. In this case, they were probably invited to submit that material. And the editor then sends the text out to peer reviewers. The peer reviewers read it, respond to it, they make critiques of it, and then those are sent back to the editor. The editor then evaluates those critiques and will tell the authors that they may need to make some corrections. The reviewers may recommend some slight modifications. They may recommend you have to revise and resubmit the article, or in this case, the book. And then the authors have to respond to those critics, and the editor determines the extent to which they need to respond. But this is a kind of appears to me to be a classic example of the authors responding to the critiques from peer reviewers. Now, I know they're responding to peer reviewers because I was a peer reviewer of one of Hugo Parego's earlier articles, not this book itself, but an earlier article that makes many of the same arguments that appears in this book. I reviewed it for Brigham Young University and University of Utah Press. And this was one of the critiques that I made, is that they need to use a multidisciplinary approach. So what they've done is they've put a response here that's going to satisfy the editor, saying, well, we're not ignoring anthropology. We're not ignoring these things. We say that they're important, but what they don't do is actually tell you what archaeology actually says. And that's where this picture of Thomas Stewart, or the book Quest for the Gold Plates, Thomas Stewart Ferguson's archaeological search for the Book of Mormon, would be an ideal example of where they ought to have considered what the archaeology tells us about the Book of Mormon alongside what the DNA tells us. And
so, Tom, if I'm understanding you correctly, okay, you've reviewed an earlier Perego paper, and it did not use multidisciplinary approach, right? And you suggested that you should use a multidisciplinary approach. And what you know is that in this book, which is co-authored by Hugo Perego, on page 6, so very early on, they say that that's important. It works best with a multidisciplinary approach, but then the rest of the book fails to actually use it.
Right. Well, they do engage in some hermeneutics, in some interpretation of the text, as scientists, I should point out. But they don't engage the archaeology. They don't engage the social and cultural studies in much depth. I will point out some other places where there are these nods to the reviewers, but they don't really fully address this. I should also say that there's been a lot of back and forth over the years, over the past 25 years, between myself, Simon Southerton, people like Angelo Baca, Janae and Hopi anthropologist, biologists like Jennifer Rath and Deborah Bolnick, who have written, all of whom have published articles on related to DNA in the Book of Mormon. And in that back and forth, these are some of the issues that myself and other authors keep bringing up, that Perego, Butler, and others that are taking this apologetic stance are ignoring the archaeology, and they're ignoring the other insights, the other critical evaluations of the text. Like, for example, the presence of the King James Bible in the Book of Mormon. That has a lot to do with how we should interpret the DNA. And so my conclusion is the best science does not erase insights from other disciplines, but that's exactly what Stephen Smoot is asking me to do. And I want to point out here a little kind of history of my own scholarship.
Hey, Tom, I want you to go through this. I'm just going to have to go take care of something, and I apologize. I'll be right back, okay?
All right.
Just go ahead and go through this slide because it's very impressive, all your scholarship, and I'll be right back in just a second. I apologize.
Well, this isn't all of it, but yeah, you're excused.
Okay, just the best stuff.
This is the scholarship before the article, Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, some of it anyway. And what I want to make the case is that I was multidisciplinary from the beginning. I was engaging in studies of race and ethnicity, in interpretations of the Book of Mormon, particularly the hermeneutics he says that I'm not qualified to address as a scientist. I was doing that work from the beginning, and it helps to explain for those who are not familiar with anthropology as a discipline why this might be relevant. So anthropology is the study of humans, and we take it what we call a holistic approach. A holistic approach means that we don't only look at the biology, we look at the biology and the culture. So we have subfields of anthropology called biological anthropology, social and cultural anthropology, archaeology, and linguistic anthropology. And so we believe that to understand human experience, you need to understand humans as animals. You need to understand humans as participants in a storied culture, a way of making meaning about the world around us. You need to understand humans as part of a symbolic system are languages that help us to understand that world that we find ourselves in. And you also need to understand humans, not just in the present, but in the past. And archaeology is the study of the record left behind by past societies. So as I chose anthropology as a discipline, as an undergraduate for a major, precisely because it was multidisciplinary. Prior to that, I had been a botany major and economics major with the intent to go into medicine and law. I was pre-law and pre-medicine. But I made a change partway through my college career to a degree in anthropology. And as I got, and it was that multidisciplinary aspect, so I could be both a scientist, a natural scientist, and a social scientist, and engage in hermeneutics or religious studies. And in fact, I earned a degree in religious studies alongside my degree in anthropology. So I have that as a degree background as well. So my bachelor's from the University of Iowa was in anthropology and religion. My master's is in anthropology from the University of Washington. My PhD is in anthropology from the University of Washington. And within my PhD, I had three major specialties: race and ethnicity, religion, and Latin American cultural context, Latin and Native American cultural context. So you can see that in the history of my scholarship. So in 1996, my first peer-reviewed publication was in Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought. I based that on some undergraduate research I did in Antigua, Guatemala, looking at the way that Guatemalans understood Mormon ethnicities in juxtaposed against the way that white Europeans in the United States understood an ethnic Mormonism. So from the beginning, I was really interested in questions of ethnicity. How do we understand ourselves as part of groups? And how does race play into that? Race and ethnicity are closely related to each other. The difference between the two is that race is often assumed to have biological characteristics with it, where ethnicity doesn't necessarily have that, although it may. And so to me, the question that was motivating a lot of my research is I was curious why my indigenous ancestors, who my grandmother told me were Iroquois, why they might have converted to a faith that when I looked at the Book of Mormon, I could see these very explicitly racist statements about a dark skin being a curse from God. And I could not understand why my ancestors might have found that attractive in a religion. And so my approach as a scholar was to engage with, particularly with indigenous Mormons, to better understand how indigenous Mormons interpreted the Book of Mormon. And so my work in Guatemala, it was funded as health research. And you see my publication, Guatemalan Hot Cold Medicine and Mormon Words of Wisdom, Intercultural Negotiations of Meaning, that was published in the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion. That was the funded part of my research. The part that came along with it was looking at those questions of ethnicity, and the Mayan and Ladino Mormons in Guatemala were asserting that they had a sacred text of their own, the Popol Vuh, that they saw as parallel to the Book of Mormon, and they were asserting an ethnic identity that insisted that they were the legitimate heirs to the house of Israel, while Europeans were only adopted into the house of Israel. And so looking at the way that played out was my initial break into academia and into Mormon studies. So I had very much had an interest in those questions of race. My article, Laban's Ghost on Writing and Transgression, is really deeply engaged in the hermeneutics. That's the interpretation of the Book of Mormon. And there I wrestled with the settler colonialism in the Book of Mormon and the way that the murder of Laban in the opening passages of the Book of Mormon act out the violence against indigenous peoples. And so again, hermeneutics was there from the beginning. My article in Ethnohistory in 1999, From Racist Stereotype to Ethnic Identity, was based on research I did in central Mexico with Nahua Mormons, particularly with a group that followed a fundamentalist by the name of Margarito Bautista that we talked about in a previous Mormonism Live episode on the Third Convention, and the ways that they understood race and ethnicity. And again, my article in 2000 from the Journal of Mormon History, Other Mormon Histories, also looked at indigenous interpretations of the Book of Mormon and Mormonism. So kind of the point I want to make is that these were the places that I specialized before I looked at the question of DNA. I turned to the question of DNA at an invitation from Brent Metcalf to write an article for an online journal called Mormon Scripture Studies that was at the request of a philanthropist that wanted a summary of DNA research and its implications for the Book of Mormon. So I agreed to write that article and did the research in 2000, 2001, and produced this article. And if you look at the title of the article, you will see the connection between what the funder wanted, the DNA work, and my interest in ethnicity or ethnogenesis, to use a specific term, that is, how does a particular ethnic group come into existence? So the title is Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. So the framing of that article from the beginning was a question about race and ethnicity, and how is that relationship between the cultural understandings and the biological understandings. And I concluded, and I will quote myself, from a scientific perspective, the Book of Mormon's origin is best situated in early 19th century America, and Lamanite Genesis can only be traced to circa 1828 from the Doctrine and Covenants. The term Lamanite is a modern social and political designation that lacks a verifiable biological or historical underpinning, linking it to ancient American Indians. The Book of Mormon emerged from an antebellum, that's a pre-Civil War perspective, out of a frontier people's struggle with their God, and not from an authentic American Indian perspective. It's from the settler perspective. As Mormons, we have a moral and ethical obligation to disavow this view of Native American origins and publicly disavow the offensive teaching that a dark skin is a physical trait of God's malediction, or is a curse from God.
You know, now that you mention it, now that I start reflecting on it, the Book of Mormon text really is written from the settler's point of view, isn't it? Even while claiming to be written from the Lamanites' point of view, or to the Lamanites.
Yeah, from the Nephites to the Lamanites. So the Nephites are essentially the counterpart for the white settlers. The indigenous people or the Lamanites are the counterpart for the indigenous people. And so those were questions that were of interest to me from the very beginning. One of the next articles I published was Sin, Skin, and Seed, Mistakes of Men in the Book of Mormon. This was an invitation from the John Whitmer Historical Association to give the spring banquet in 2004. That spring banquet is an association with the Community of Christ General Conference. What was interesting is I presented this research to the president and general authorities of the Community of Christ at their invitation. A very different reception that I was getting from Latter-day Saints. And in that article, I wrote, historical and biological research suggest that common Latter-day Saint beliefs associating skin color with wickedness, seed with male privilege, and American Indians with the Book of Mormon should be relegated to the category of mistakes of men. These beliefs echo the ethnocentrism, prejudice, and privilege of white men in the 19th century. Again, from the beginning, these were the issues of concern to me. Now, interesting, they mentioned the term Galileo event
Yeah, I thought that wasn't very humble of you to call your own discovery a Galileo event there, Thomas.
Right. Yeah, that's the accusation that has been made by Dan Peterson in particular. And so I want to correct the record a little bit and give kudos to my good friend Brent Metcalf, who coined the term Galileo event. I did use it in an article I co-published with Simon Southerton, and I did use it as subheadings in Laymanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. But I borrowed that concept and idea from Brent. Brent introduced the term at Sunstone in 2000 and organized a related panel the following year. That panel, DNA and Laymanite Identity, brought together myself and Trent Stevens and Jeff Meldrum to discuss the new DNA research and its implications for the Book of Mormon. That coincided with the release of my article, Laymanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, in an online form in Mormon Scripture Studies. And then updated version would later appear the following year in American Apocrypha. Now, Brent defined a Galileo event as something that occurs when the cognitive dissonance between empirical evidence and a theological tenet is so severe that a religion will abandon the tenet, acquiescing to the empirical data. I think this was a good prediction that that DNA would be the Galileo event, because this prediction came true. By 2006, the church had changed the introduction to the Book of Mormon in the Doubleday edition, and then in 2007 in their own English editions, although it would continue to say the principal ancestors of American Indians in many international editions. It may still do it in some international ones. But I know, at least from the Spanish, that continued for many years later. The accusation that I was presenting myself as a Galileo of Mormonism was one of the critiques that was used to kind of belittle my research. There was actually, though, someone who did suggest that I was the Galileo of Mormonism, and that was Maxine Hanks. Thank you, Maxine, if you're listening. That's tongue in cheek. And it led to a lot of ridicule of me as kind of presenting myself as some Galileo. And so I published an article in Sunstone called Inventing Galileo that gave my version of the events. In that same Sunstone, Brent Metcalf wrote an article, Reinventing Laymanite Identity, that shows the changes over time from that hemispheric to a limited geography.
Yes. So basically, this is all Brent Metcalf's fault.
Indeed, right?
Yeah. I think we found out who to blame.
Yeah, maybe he'll come on during the call-in.
That'd be great.
So did we fail to consider a limited geographic setting and use a hemispheric geography as a straw man, as I think it was Neil had suggested we did?
Stephen B. Smoot said that.
Oh, it was Stephen Smoot. Okay.
I know he said it.
Okay. Well, in my article, Laymanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, I devoted 7 pages to a limited geography, and I concluded, and I will quote again, no traces of Hebrew DNA markers appeared in Central America or elsewhere among Native Americans.
Wait, you did address the limited geography theory?
Indeed, we looked at, or I looked at DNA, not just throughout the hemisphere, but very specifically in Central America, and found no more evidence there than anywhere else for Hebrew ancestry among Indigenous Americans.
And when was this?
That was my original article in 2002.
That's over 20 years ago. So
right.
Why is it that Stephen B. Smoot is saying that that's not true, that you haven't even addressed the limited geography?
Well, he suggested that what I did is in my next article, which is simply implausible DNA in a Mesoamerican setting, that I argued that the Book of Mormon does not support a limited geography. I do, in fact, make that argument. And it is, in fact, hermeneutics. Okay. What I argue, similarly to what Brent argued around the same time, is that if you look at the Book of Mormon text carefully, there aren't descriptions of these other populations. Where if you contrast that with the Bible, there's plenty of mention of Persians and Egyptians and other people outside of Israel and Palestine, or the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. There's plenty of acknowledgement of a larger cultural and social and cultural context. You don't see that in the Book of Mormon. It's something that has to be brought to the text. Mm-hmm. It's an interpretation that emerged after Reverend Lamb, I think it was in the 1880s. He was a reverend in Salt Lake City who published a critique of the Gold Bible, and in it he pointed out the contradictions in the distances traveled and the hemispheric geography that at that time was included in the footnotes of the Book of Mormon. So that hemispheric geography had places pinpointed throughout the text, like, you know, identifying the narrow neck of land and stuff with Panama.
So we can actually look at the footnotes in the early copies of the Book of Mormon to show that it was official church doctrine, whatever you want to call it, that there was a hemispheric model for the Book of Mormon.
In the 1879 version of the Book of Mormon, that the footnotes were created by Orson Pratt. Yeah, in that version. So that was the one that Reverend Lamb was responding to. So
by the way, just so you know, I don't know if it was in that clip. I watched that whole podcast, and I went back and watched more of it today.
Yeah.
But there was one place in there where they basically misrepresent it. They're being sneaky. So it's probably Smoot. But what he's doing is he says it goes back to the 1920s where we have this talk in General Conference where they're talking about a limited geography. That's in response to Lamb.
Right.
But what Smoot is doing is disconnecting it. He doesn't mention Lamb, and he just says they already started talking about a limited geography way before DNA strands were even discovered.
Yeah, well, that part is true, that there was some discussion of it.
But they were responding to another threat, another problem.
And they were also adopting this stuff from the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, what's now known as the Community of Christ. So before any of the LDS scholars were talking about a limited geography, the Lewis Hill, who was an RLDS scholar, had proposed a limited geography based and modeled upon the Popol Vuh, which is this Mayan text that is like a local history with a limited geography. Mm-hmm. And he was using the Popol Vuh as a model for understanding the Book of Mormon.
Right. The Reorganites came up with that limited geography first before the Mormons did, a fact that the Heartland theorists never get tired of reminding us.
Right. So, you know, I also, you know, from the article Simply Impossible, I concluded the evidence collected to date from Central America is just as problematic for the Book of Mormon as that found elsewhere. I spent 2 chapters of my dissertation addressing limited settings in both North and Mesoamerica. They weren't calling it the Heartland model at that time yet, but Ed Goebel and
oh dear Lord, Ed Goebel,
what is his name?
They let him out of his cell.
Yeah, well, yeah, they had a book on Zarahemla at the time that I critiqued. Simon Southerton devoted about 50 pages to the topic of limited geographies and losing a lost tribe, Native Americans, DNA, and the Book of Mormon. Both those books are still available from Signature Books. And those who have downloaded the slideshow from my academia page can follow the links directly to Signature Books there.
Well, great. That's fantastic.
So
hang on a second. Oh, I was thinking George Goebel. Goebel de Block.
Ed Goebel and Wayne May. That's their names.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yes. So the famous Heartlanders. Is that true?
Right. I mean, they were Heartlanders before they were Heartlanders. Before
they were Heartlanders before Heartlanders were cool.
Yeah. Before they were Heartlanders before Rod Meldrum coined the term. I think it was him that coined the term.
Well, at least they have a name. I can
Yeah.
remember Heartlanders, but it's just the Mesoamerican thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mesoamericanists is often what they say. So as our dear friend podcasters suggested, is the science settled? I argue not entirely, although we do agree that there is a lack of Middle Eastern or Israelite DNA in ancient remains, as well as in modern descendants of indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere. So we agree that there is no DNA evidence of the Book of Mormon.
Yes, that is unequivocal.
We also agree, quote, from their book, page 52, all ancient genomes from the Americas have closer affinities to contemporary Native American peoples than to any other populations. We agree. What I disagree with is Butler and Parego's DNerAsure argument that Book of Mormon populations would, quote, have no living descendants at all, or that their DNA signature would not be present in living descendants.
Erasing the DNA.
That's the point I disagree with. What they do is they exaggerate the likelihood that the DNA would have disappeared by actually referring to some actual ways that DNA lineages could possibly disappear. And
can I just say something to Bill here for a second, Tom?
Sure.
And of course, I'm saying it to you too, but Bill, do you remember that whole dumbass Book of Abraham argument that the catalyst theory?
I remember the catalyst theory.
And that, yeah, Joseph Smith, he wasn't translating Egyptian. He thought he was, but he wasn't really. God was just beaming down some other kind of divine narrative that Joseph Smith wrote down. And that we've talked about how it's, you know, we even named a podcast after it, I think, indistinguishable from a fraud.
Yeah, indiscernible from a fraud.
Yeah, this is the exact same kind of argument. If you can go back just one slide there, Tom.
It's the same game.
Yeah, it looks like a fraud. In other words, this is exactly what you would expect to find if it were a fraud.
This is
that there's no DNA evidence that supports the Book of Mormon claims.
This is the number one play in the apologetic handbook, is that the critic presents the most rational view, which has the believer going like, uh-oh, it actually works in their favor. So now we have to create some mental gymnastic answer that allows the believer to sense like, oh, if we make a ton of allowances, then that will explain why we find what the critic would expect to find, but it still equals belief. And so as you point out, you take any one of these issues, the catalyst theory is a way to go, you're right. It looks like Joseph Smith is not translating the Egyptian papyri. But if we allow this to be revelation, if we allow God to not inform Joseph that he's translating papyri, if we come up with 5 or 6 other things we need to be in place, then by golly, the evidence might look like it's in favor of the critic, but it actually allows this little bit of room where it could still work in our favor. And you see that play out here. Again, the Book of Mormon tells a story where people show up and there's no one there. And in fact, as you guys pointed out, when they do meet some other group, it's important to them and they make note of it. Yet we're supposed to believe that they're living for, hundreds and hundreds, 1,000 years among other people, and they just don't even talk about it.
So
it's discernible.
So in my book and that article, White as a Night, I cite a historian by the name of Dale Morgan, who put forth in the 1940s a catalyst theory for the Book of Mormon. He argued that a particular text that I discuss at length in my book, David Cusick's 1827 Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, may have been the catalytic agent that inspired Joseph Smith's production of the Book of Mormon. Dale Morgan made this argument in the 1940s, and it largely has escaped notice of most scholars because it sat in a library in California, and people didn't look at it until it was published in the 1980s in an edited volume of Dale Morgan's work by I think it was John Walker, and So I've kind of, I guess, re-encountered this. But what's interesting about Dale Morgan's catalytic theory is it's what he called a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon. So his catalyst is a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon.
Interesting. I thought there was some other guy who came up with that catalyst theory for the Book of Mormon. Was it an Osler? Was it Blake? Was it Blake, right?
Well, Blake came up with the expansion theory of the Book of Mormon, which is the same sort of idea. We find material in the Book of Mormon that seems apparently from Joseph Smith's milieu. So rather than it being gold plates to Book of Mormon pages of paper, we have to now impose that we have to make room that what if Joseph translated the gold plates, but also inserted a bunch of his own narrative in? What if we made room for that? And it was just a mix of both.
What if we did that? Why don't we just do that? So then you got the 50 to 75% of the Book of Mormon that even the apologists are throwing up their hands and saying, forget about it. Obviously, it came from Joseph Smith's environment. But this other 25%, see, that's the real stuff. That's what was on the plates. Everything else, Joseph Smith just threw in there from his own environment, because that's what you do when an angel shows up and gives you gold plates and special means to translate and says, translate this. You just throw in all of your own shit.
Yeah. And back to Thomas, the DNA is just more of the same, that we don't find it. The Book of Mormon says a certain kind of story. So not only do we have to posit how the DNA disappeared, which is calls on you to stretch your mind too far, you also have to believe that there are people here when they arrive, which also stretches your mind too far based on what the book itself says. But apologists are always working in this space where if you just make allowances and leave a little bit of wiggle room, then believers can continue to believe.
Yeah.
If you just make the Book of Mormon say what it doesn't say.
Right. So Bill,
this next one,
the slide.
I'm sorry.
What I want to shift now to is a little bit of discussion of this book, a little more discussion of this book, its strengths and weaknesses. I would give it 3 out of 5 stars. I would encourage interested listeners to read the book. Despite some significant flaws, it provides an overall representation of the science, a valuable overall representation of the science, and is the best apologetic treatment of the subject to date. So I do recommend the book. But
I at first I was wondering, how can you recommend it when it's got errors in it? But I thought, does that mean 1 star immediately? 1 error, 1 star? But then I thought about that podcast. I have not read the book, Tom, but I watched this dang podcast twice. Okay. And I'll tell you, I was astonished. I would recommend watching that podcast.
Yeah.
I was astonished to find that 3, they call themselves informed saints. They do know a lot about apologetics. They're apologists, completely giving the entire field over to Tom Murphy and saying, you were right. You were right all along. We admit it. But for some reason, we still don't like you. We still think that you're a bad guy.
Didn't quite put it in those words, though.
Yeah, they should have, though.
The key strengths of the book is that it acknowledges the lack of DNA evidence supporting Book of Mormon migrations to the Americas. And it also, and this is probably the most valuable contribution, is it refutes the claims made by Heartland advocates that the mitochondrial DNA lineage X2A supports Book of Mormon migration accounts. They show clearly that X2A is way too old to have been a Book of Mormon related lineage, and that even though you can find X2A also in and around Israel and the Middle East, it's not exclusive to there. It's found in Europe, Africa, and Asia, throughout parts of Asia anyway. But the variants of the X2A that are found in Israel are not ancestral to the Native American lineages. And so they are more like cousins, distant cousins, than descendants of the X lineage. There's no X2A lineage in Israel, but the X lineage that's in Israel.
And they mentioned that in this video too, and I think that's the clip I have. So here's the interesting thing. Okay, you've got the Heartlanders who've got this X2A thing in Kennewick, man, and they're doing the dance of joy because this guy was a Nephite. The problem is that First off, there's all sorts of problems with it. It's not X, it's X2A, and like you mentioned. But the main thing is, the easiest thing to remember is it's thousands and thousands of years too early for the Book of Mormon. It can't be a Nephite. So, of course, they've had to monkey with the DNA and say, not DNA, but the carbon dating, right? And they've had a field day trying to change that. But the problem is this. So here's the spectacle, okay? I'm watching 3 informed saints talking about 2 experts in the field who've written this book. And they are saying there is absolutely no Middle East DNA in the Americas that relates to the Book of Mormon. And even the one exception with Kennewick Man that the Heartlanders are pointing to, that's not it either, because it's way too early. So that's not Book of Mormon DNA.
Yeah, and Hugo Perego is an expert on X2A. He's published probably more on that topic than anybody else in the world. So that's valuable contribution. Now, the next 3 items I have to say as strengths are, I will admit, are probably responses to my previous peer review of their work, or maybe that of others who made similar arguments. That is, they concede that there is a history of exploitation and abuse in the gathering and use of DNA from indigenous populations. And they assert that science is only one way of knowing, and that they endorse the inherent right of indigenous people to tell their own stories. And I want to dig deeper into those in relationship to their weaknesses. Their exaggerated allegations of disappearing DNA are, again, a form of erasure, supporting or suggesting that indigenous people cannot trust their own DNA and should turn to the Book of Mormon instead. That's where they'll find the truth, but they won't find the truth in their own bodies. They fail to acknowledge or apologize for their own role, particularly Hugo Perego's role, and that of BYU in exploitative uses of DNA from indigenous peoples. And I'm going to delve a little deeper into that. They fail to point readers to indigenous authors telling their own stories, not even those coming from indigenous Latter-day Saints, whose voices they also erase. So let's look at the DNerAsure. And here we can go. You see that DNA disappearing. When they're discussing admixture events, that's when 2 populations come together and begin sharing their DNA with each other. And the likelihood that some lineages might disappear. Butler and Perego's examples rely on research in mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosomes. And that would be your maternal and your paternal ancestors. You inherit, in terms of the mitochondria, we inherit from our mothers a separate set of DNA from that in the nucleus of our cell. And that's in the mitochondria, which are these organelles in the cytoplasm of the cell. They have their own DNA that comes directly from your mother, whether you're a man or a woman. And so they rely on that mitochondrial DNA, and they rely on the X chromosome that men inherit from their fathers. These types of DNA, or the maternal and paternal lineages, are where the numbers of distinguishing genetic markers in any individual are relatively small when contrasted with our DNA in the nucleus of our cells, the autosomal DNA.
So autosomal DNA is much more detailed. Is that right?
Right. It has many, many more markers, millions of more markers that
I see.
potentially be.
So that's much more likely to continue through multiple generations.
Indeed, right?
Or to be recognized, at least.
Yeah. So this approach is kind of a bait and switch. It wildly exaggerates the likelihood of DNerAsure. So for the most part, they don't cite sources on these claims about DNerAsure, about erasing DNA. But when they do, it's to the mitochondrial examples.
And is that an older technology?
It's been around longer, yes.
Yes. And the autosomal, that's probably more expensive too.
Yeah, more expensive and more recent. But they do make an interesting concession, probably in response to a reviewer. On page 41 to 42, they say, quote, "Some traces of the autosomal DNA may persist over generations, but this will become more diluted over time, and depending on the roll of the dice with each new generation, may be extinguished at some point.
That doesn't sound very specific. How many generations are they talking about?
They don't tell you that, do they? Well, no, they don't tell you how much time is needed to dilute millions of autosomal DNA markers, right? And just
They
as a
don't
hint
tell us.
here,
What is the answer?
living humans outside of Africa have inherited no Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA. Okay, and so there was a while, in fact, when I wrote Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, we thought that that Neanderthals were not among our ancestors. But after they did the nuclear DNA analyses, turns out that we retain about 1 to 2%, people from outside of Africa anyway, retain about 1 to 2% of their nuclear DNA from admixture that occurred more than 40,000 years ago.
So the autosomal is so detailed. There's so many markers that we can tell after 40,000 years that people living outside of Africa have 1 to 2% of their nuclear DNA going back to Neanderthal.
Yeah. And there was probably not that many people in many events of mating between Neanderthals and humans. And yet we still have evidence 40,000 years later. But 2,600 years ago,
that's the Book of Mormon, folks. And that's when it starts. It ends 1,600 years ago.
Right.
So, but it starts 2,600 years ago, giving it the very best shot it possibly could, 600 BCE. That is substantially less time than 40,000 years.
Yeah. And so this is how they're manufacturing the appearance of disappearance, if you will. Okay. Is they're creating this scenario that couldn't possibly have happened. Well, they'd say maybe this maybe, if you use their terms, may be extinguished is dependent on a faulty assumption of a consistently unfavorable roll of the dice over an undetermined length of time. In other words, they're assuming a not random process. When the models that they're discussing and the sources they're citing are assuming a random process. So what, in essence, if you read this critically, what it says, some traces of autosomal DNA may persist over generations, but this will become more diluted over time. We're not saying how long. And depending on the roll of the dice, so now it's no longer random, with each new generation may be extinguished at some point. So theoretically, it could have disappeared it could have disappeared if it wasn't particularly random and we had enough time, then this Israelite DNA could have disappeared.
So it's only going to be extinguished at some point if you get the rolls of the dice bad for you every single generation.
Yeah, millions of times with millions of different.
You're flipping a coin a million times,
right?
and what their model says is it's got to come up heads every time.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, yeah. And
Thomas,
it's not just human DNA; it's dog DNA, it's lice DNA, it's and it's. I mean, it's not a very convincing case.
When I read the gospel topic essay on DNA, and I hear Ugo's voice there when he's talking about genetic drift, right?
Right.
When I went back to say, like, okay, like let me just explore this again. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a scientist by any means. But as I read the work of other people and study what it takes for genetic drift to work to the degree that's required for the Book of Mormon, as you guys are pointing out, you need bad luck when it comes to preserving DNA. You need bad luck to happen generation after generation after generation after generation among a whole group of people.
Right. But the Book of Mormon says they reproduced exceedingly, right? That they flourished in this environment. Not only they, but the plants and animals they brought with them flourished in these environments. So where is the DNA evidence from the animals they supposedly brought with them, from the plants and seeds they supposedly brought with them? It doesn't exist, right?
It's the same problem. I've talked about this before on the show. As you point out, Nephi travels across the water. The Jaredites get on the barges and travel across. They say they brought their seeds with them, and that soon as they got on land, they plant their crops because that's how they sustained themselves. And at least in one of those instances, I don't remember if it's the Nephite instance or the Jaredite instance, but in one of those instances, it said that those seeds were planted and those plants flourished, as you just said. And so it's not just the DNA of humans, it's the DNA of every single creature, plant, person they said they brought with them. There isn't a single trace of any of it.
Right.
At least the animals they said they brought with them that were actually here.
Yeah. So
I've got to ask you a question. Okay.
Okay.
I want you to come to a full stop where you want to. Okay. And then I'm going to ask you the question about that project 25 years ago.
Well, this is where we're going to get into it right here.
Okay, then I want to ask this question because it blew my mind last night when we were talking on the phone. I think I've heard this before. I don't think I ever heard anybody put it to me the way you did, though, which suddenly made me realize this. And I think I put it back to you this way and you agreed. So let me try it again here. Are you saying, is it true that 25 years ago or so, around the turn of the century, that a massive amount of money was put into a project to collect and analyze massive amounts of Native American DNA in order to try to prove the Book of Mormon true?
Yes, that effort was done at BYU, and Hugo Perego played a key role, as well as Scott Woodward, who I should note is a relative of my wife's by marriage. And I'll say too that I couldn't say this in my Lamanite Genesis genealogy and genetics, but because Scott asked me not to cite his work, but he later published the work he'd sent me an early draft of, where he made these same arguments that you hear Hugo Perego making about genetic drift and gene flow and bottleneck events. So I was very much aware of those arguments, those counter arguments, before writing Lamanite Genesis genealogy and genetics. But out of a courtesy to my cousin-in-law, Scott Woodward, I did not discuss them in Lamanite Genesis genealogy and genetics because he asked me not to. But basically, they had a program that was funded by Ira Fulton and James Sorensen, and it was called the Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Research Group. And so this is in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Brigham Young University accumulated the largest collection of indigenous DNA in the world in apparent hope of vindicating the Book of Mormon. And in this book, again, probably responding to reviewers like me, because I know I brought this up with Hugo, quote, DNA from indigenous populations has been gathered and used in exploitative ways against their wishes and that of their descendants.
Well, they're the ones who did it, though.
Yeah, they're the ones. They weren't the only ones. Okay. They were collecting this DNA without going through institutional review processes or ethical review by foreign governments. They were collecting it in other countries, and that didn't go through review by any indigenous governments. The only ethical review it went through was at BYU. And indigenous communities, particularly in New Zealand, were protesting that the BYU was acquiring their DNA without an ethical review process in ways that were exploitative and abusive towards indigenous peoples. And yet they don't acknowledge that, they could apologize for this. They could make it right. Part of the problem, and the reason I have this article rejecting racism in any form, Latter-day Saint rhetoric, religion, and repatriation. This may be the one they say where I argue that the Book of Mormon is especially racist. But this is an article I co-authored with the DNA and Hopi anthropologist Angelo Baca. And we trace what happened to some of that DNA, basing our work in particular on that of Kim Tallbear, whose book, Native American DNA, repeats these indigenous concerns about the misuse of DNA by Latter-day Saints. And she alleges, and others as well have alleged that what happened to that Sorensen Molecular Genealogy Research Group DNA is that in 2003, after the publication of my book, Scott Woodward gets dismissed from BYU, and the Molecular Genealogy Research Group goes off on its own, separate from BYU. We don't know all the reasons for that. Scott did tell me that it had to do with a change in leadership. And that's all I know for sure. It may have been these ethics allegations. It may have been the fact that the DNA didn't support the Book of Mormon.
Okay, now that's the thing. That's the thing. That's the full stop.
Yeah.
The church, through its philanthropic arm or members at BYU, they gather this massive project of DNA in order to prove the Book of Mormon true. And after millions of dollars and years of research, the answer is no, there's none. Mm-hmm. So then they let your second cousin go or cousin-in-law go, and they get rid of it. They move it off campus. They're not interested really in it anymore. Is that right? So
they get booted from BYU, and then they create this. They had a nonprofit organization to begin with. They turn it into a for-profit venture called Gene Tree. Gene Tree eventually gets acquired by what we know today as Ancestry. And so Gene Tree and Ancestry began to profit off of that indigenous DNA that had been donated by people coming to LDS chapels around the world.
Doing their 23andMe, and I imagine that's just the tip of the iceberg.
And so that has created a lot of consternation in indigenous communities, a concern about the church and the way that it's used DNA. It's also created headaches for Ancestry, and they've had to change some of their practices as a result of ethical allegations. But if you want to learn more about that, check out the article "Rejecting Racism in Any Form." Now, Butler and Perego acknowledge an indigenous right to self-determination. The indigenous people have a right of telling their own stories, yet you don't see anywhere in their book any discussion of indigenous people's versions of where they came from.
It looks like all these comments that seem to have come from reviewers, but they don't follow through on, show up in the first pages of the book.
Yeah. And they don't follow through. And they could have pointed to the readers to indigenous authors telling their own stories, particularly those of indigenous Latter-day Saints. And that's what I've tried to do since the publication of Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. I felt it was really important that indigenous voices did not get lost in the process. Fortunately, one of the people that contacted me shortly after some of the publicity about my research was he was a student at the University of Washington, Angelo Baca, a Janae and Hopi anthropologist that I've mentioned. He was a student at the time. He worked on a film called In Layman's Terms, looking at Lamanite identity. So both Simon Southerton and I helped him with this. And he was able to interview a large number of indigenous Mormons and indigenous scholars and look at their perspectives about the Book of Mormon and DNA in particular, and turn that into a film that's still available online at Culture Unplugged. Angelo and I have gone on to write several more articles about DNA and the Book of Mormon. This includes one called DNA and the Book of Mormon, Science, Settlers, and Scripture. That appears in this book, LDS Gospel Topic Series. And this is one of the places where we make the case that of an indigenous right to tell their own story. So it's clear that even though Butler and Perego don't cite this article, they're aware of it. I know they are because I sent them copies of it. And Science and Fiction, Kennewick Man, the Ancient One, and Latter-day Saint Discourse, we published as well. We also, both of us, contributed to a volume called Decolonizing Mormonism, Approaching a Post-Colonial Zion. Here we brought indigenous and settler scholars together, where we looked at these problems with colonialism and the way that DNA plays into the settler colonial assumptions of the Book of Mormon.
By the way, Tom, what I want to make clear here, just excuse me, is that when I mentioned that these little comments are in the early pages of the book, that's the easy way to do it, right? You give all these comments of things that their book could improve on, and instead of actually using them, you just take the comments, reword them, and stick them in a new preface or introduction.
Without actually changing the content of the book in a significant way. But here they could have cited this work that afterward in Decolonizing Mormonism, written by the Taos Pueblo scholar P. Jane Hafen, directly addresses DNA issues. And she argues that presenting the Book of Mormon as the one and only true story of ancient America is a colonizing act, and that listening to indigenous people tell their own stories is a decolonizing act. Okay, and so they could have shared P. Jane Hafen's perspective, but they don't.
But they did say that it would be a good thing if they had.
Yeah, they're certainly aware of it because Hugo Perego, Angelo Baca, and I were invited to BYU by P. Jane Hafen and Brendan Rensink at the Red Center. This was back in 2016. And that's where I first met Hugo Perego in person. He's now, I should say, a member of my mother-in-law's board in Nauvoo, Illinois. And she talks about him a lot, but I haven't run into him while I've been in Nauvoo. I hope to.
You had a certain experience with Hugo that you mentioned to me last night, and you said you were okay with repeating it.
Yeah. So that relates to this book, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. So this was an invitation to engage with indigenous perspectives about Mormon history. And initially, they invited me to write an article about DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I told them the same thing I told you, RFM, the first time you asked me to talk about DNA in the Book of Mormon on your podcast. I said, I got something more interesting to talk about. And that's Iroquois in the Book of Mormon, or Haudenosaunee people in the Book of Mormon. So when they said, okay, we'll look at your piece on Haudenosaunee in the Book of Mormon, or the Iroquois, and asked Hugo Perego to write the article instead. So Hugo Perego, with help from Michael Ash, wrote an article that would have appeared in Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. But I was one of the reviewers for that, as were several Native scholars and scholars at BYU. And the editors there, P. Jane Hafen and Brendan Rensink, made the decision that because they didn't legitimately address these concerns, that they would not include their article in the book. So basically, when indigenous scholars have been part of the review process, they have rejected Hugo Perego's work.
Ooh, ouch. That's telling.
Yeah. So I appreciate the acknowledgement, but you need to do more than just put the word out there. Now, I will say, and this is where my heart goes out to him. So Hugo Perego did offer to give me a ride home from the hotel, or from BYU to the hotel one of the evenings. And we had a good chance to talk together in the car. I'll say he's a warm, friendly guy. He's a great scientist. Okay. But he also, I guess, in an effort to connect with me personally, he shared some of his own fears of potential church discipline for his writings on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I think that when you read his work, you have to take that into account, that he is, if he doesn't toe the line, he might end up in the same place that I ended up, having a disciplinary court scheduled because I didn't toe the line on the Book of Mormon.
See, this blew my mind when you were telling me this last night, because I had never, ever even thought to look at it from Ugo's perspective, who is a scientist. So he has certain things he's supposed to adhere to, like the scientific method. And he's a DNA expert, right in the right field, right guy, right place, right time. Maybe there's a reason for that. But now all of his findings are against the church. He's finding nothing that he hopes to find and everything that he doesn't want to find. And he has to now write a paper about it and summarize his findings, even though he knows that he's writing it for people who really, really, really want those findings to favor the Book of Mormon, at least a little bit. And he was concerned that by writing the truth about what the scientific findings were, that he might be seen as an enemy to the church by higher ups, and they might move against him. Is that right?
Yeah. And I will say that kudos to his diplomatic skills, because I apparently didn't have them, right? His ability to navigate that terrain. At that time, he was a church education system employee, right? So he really very carefully navigated that terrain. I was not very good at it. I was too blunt. And, you know, he's got more skills than I do there.
Because he came up with those three excuses. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. I mean, he creates this potential scenario where if this, which would never happen, but if it did happen, then there would be no DNA.
The founder effect, the bottleneck, and the something shifting or drifting.
Genetic drift.
Yeah. Not to be
these are all ways that that affect the distribution of genetic markers within a population.
Yes.
That theoretically can make some lineages disappear over time.
Yes. Well, it's a good thing those are around, because the Mormon apologists really need them.
So interestingly, after I had actually developed the first draft of this slideshow, earlier this week, I saw a new person who has been now apparently brought on to the Ancient America Foundation. I should say that Ancient America Foundation is the funder behind Informed Saints. This is a nonprofit.
The funder?
Yeah, it's a nonprofit organization that was founded by V. Garth Norman. He's the guy that's famous for the Ixtapa Tree of Life stone.
He didn't make it, but what did he do with the Ixtapa Tree of Life stone, the Stella 5?
He claimed that that was evidence of the Lehi's vision in the Book of Mormon. So
was this back in the 1950s?
He's the archaeologist that made that claim. So this foundation was at least named in his honor. I don't know to what extent he was directly involved in it, but it's named in his honor. Some people still believe that. Yeah, right. And so this is the organization that funded Informed Saints. And Xander Sturgill, I had been recently seeing many of his posts online and found him to be a refreshing new Dene or Navajo influencer, adding an indigenous voice to discussions. He's doing some great looks at the conflicts between Mormon settlers and indigenous peoples of Utah, visiting massacre sites and talking about those conflicts that garnered my attention for sure, because that's another area I've done a fair amount of work on. And he appeared on his Facebook post with a copy of our book, Decolonizing Mormonism. Oh, yeah. I was impressed that he's reading this material. He said, well, he wants to see both sides. So he identifies himself as a Latter-day Saint, and he has acknowledged that he's now doing some material for Ancient America Foundation. I don't know if they're paying him. I hope they are. But he's got some connections to them. I don't know that this video is one that they may be related to, but I do want to share a little clip from his video and offer some thoughts about it. Here we go.
So, because Latter-day Saints have assumed that Native Americans were direct descendants of Hebrew Book of Mormon peoples, people have wondered if we could find Hebrew DNA in Native Americans today. And some Latter-day Saints have even pushed claims that they found DNA evidence in Native Americans. In fact, this idea became so prevalent that the church itself put out an essay addressing it, actually telling members that we can't use DNA studies to make such claims because the science simply doesn't support it. So the stuff that some members are claiming to find is based on deeply misunderstood genetics. They don't take into account things like the age of the samples they're testing, or the possibility of late contamination, or that just because two types of DNA are named the same, it doesn't mean that they are the same. They can be two totally different branches. So an answer to this is a lot more complicated to address here in this video because it's all about DNA and genetics. So we'll do an entire video about it later, but basically, after a couple thousand years, the Book of Mormon peoples would have mixed with the Native Americans already in the land. And so any evidence would have been lost of Hebrew DNA. And that's not a cop-out here. It's just basic genetics. So here's a small example of that. I'm half Navajo, and archaeology suggests that we came from the Canada area fairly late, sometime around 1300 AD. But even though we came from that area, our DNA is apparently more similar to the DNA of Southwest Native Americans like the Pueblo or the Hopi or the Utes, simply because we've mixed so much over the last hundreds of years. So again, a longer video for later, but here's what the church says. Arguments that some defenders of the Book of Mormon make based on DNA studies are also speculative. In short, DNA studies cannot be used decisively to either affirm or reject the historical authenticity of the Book of Mormon.
Tom,
Another-
sounds like you disagree with that last part because you hold the position that DNA studies do. What was the word he used? Absolutely destroy the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah, to challenge the Book of Mormon. So actually, I do like the fact that he is taking on the Heartland group and using similar arguments to what Butler and Prego are doing. So kudos to him for that. In fact, I enjoy his content and I encourage listeners to follow it. But his assessment of the likelihood of Hebrew DNA disappearing repeats those misleading claims by Butler and Prego. And I'd like to actually comment a little bit about the example he used. So, the Diné or Navajo language is an Athabascan language. And so it's a different language group than that of the Pueblo peoples around them. And archaeology suggests this migration from the north that he mentioned that shows up in the DNA, very importantly, shows up in the DNA. But because there was mixture between the Athabascan speakers and the Pueblo peoples, the DNA of Navajos today shows a strong connection to the local populations of the Southwest.
As you would expect.
What it does not do is disappear. And
Right.
so the example he's using actually supports the argument I've been making all along, is that Athabascan roots is still very much present in Diné DNA in Navajo.
It is, but it only goes back to 1300 CE.
Yeah,
right?
so
And I think the implication I was left with by what he said was there's more Hopi in it now than there is the original Navajo, with the implication that, that's just the last 700 years. Give it another 700 and it's going to be gone entirely. And that's what happened with the Book of Mormon Hebrew population DNA.
That's the suggestion that he's making, but it's based again on these faulty assumptions used by Butler and Prego. What I would encourage Xander to do, and I sent him a note, let him know that I was going to talk about this tonight. And what I would encourage him to do is when he does this longer video, read P. Jane Hafen's work, what she has to say about DNA, and include that as an alternative. Read the work that Angelo Baca and I have done, where we're showing that, in fact, there's a strong segment among a large, I don't know, I shouldn't say large, I don't know how large the number of indigenous intellectuals within the LDS Church, but there are certainly a fair number of indigenous intellectuals in the LDS Church that treat the Book of Mormon as allegory, and as one of many scriptures alongside their own sacred narratives from their own peoples. And that needs to be presented as an alternative to the Church's statements on the DNA. So, Xander, I would encourage you to engage with your indigenous colleagues and give that as an alternative to treating the Book of Mormon as history. And that in particular would be a much more decolonizing move. And here I want to recommend, and I know this is on Xander's reading list, and I think it ought to be on everybody's reading list here, is Elise Boxer's new book, Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. This came out last fall. Elise is a Dakota Latter-day Saint scholar, an active LDS. She's an associate professor of history and Native American studies at the University of South Dakota. And she argues in her book, Mormon settlers asserted their right to possess indigenous lands and in the process destroyed indigenous identity, history, and land. That erasure that I've been talking about. She says, quote, the very nature of the Lamanite subject position was meant to be controlled, produced, and operationalized by Mormon settlers through the LDS Church and related religious ideologies. And she says, indigenous people are only ever useful when in service to Mormon settler ideologies that sustain Mormon whiteness. This is
like the Lamanite generation?
Right. This is the danger that Xander's in as well, is that if he really pushes a decolonizing agenda, he may no longer be useful. Elise Boxer is herself taking a lot of risk in this work. But I think it's a must read for scholars of the Book of Mormon.
Very good. By the way, on this last one, the last slide, Tom.
The previous.
Let me see if I can remember the question I had.
About Xander?
It actually isn't about Xander. It's about the bottom right. So what I'm understanding is that in this book that the podcast was about that you were holding up there, this new book by Butler and Perego, Let's Talk About How DNA Destroys the Book of Mormon, that what they're actually doing is they are misleading. They're giving misleading statements about the science in order to make it sound like DNA does not prove the Book of Mormon is not historical.
Right.
So they're misleading people to make them think there's a chance.
Right. They're giving the hope where none is warranted. So as we're wrapping up to those the bringing in some calls, I do want to remind people that I have a new book out called Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. There's a discount available from University of Utah Press for pre-orders. If you follow the QR code on the screen, it'll take you to the University of Utah Press's website, where you can pre-order the book with the discount code Murphy25 and get 25% off. This book does what Hugo Perego and John Butler do not do. And that is, I put Mormon stories about how American Indians or Lamanites came to be into dialogue with Haudenosaunee or Iroquois stories about how Mormons came to be. Because it turns out that the indigenous people around the New York area where Joseph Smith said he found a set of gold plates have some stories about Joseph Smith. They say that he stole some of their stories and that he put them into the Book of Mormon. In some cases, some versions of the story say that it was a collaborative endeavor, that they willingly shared some of the stories, and that these stories end up in the Book of Mormon. So what I do in the book is I go back to the 1820s and look at what we know about the Haudenosaunee oral tradition that was available then, and the stories of the Book of Mormon, and how there are portions that are similar to and different from the indigenous stories. And I use those differences, not just the similarities, but use the differences to kind of peel back a dialogue that was occurring in the 1820s between indigenous people and European settlers that is represented in the Book of Mormon, but they only provide the settler perspective, and that there are actually a number of indigenous texts and oral traditions that provide the other side of the story, provide the indigenous side of the story. The Book of Mormon co-opts some of those, like the Mohegan preacher Samson Occam, who was recast in the Book of Mormon as Samuel the Lamanite. It turns out we can actually go and read Samson Occam's diaries and see what he has to say for himself. Also, I discuss at quite a bit of length Dale Morgan's catalyst theory of the Book of Mormon that Joseph Smith borrowed from or was inspired by David Cusick's 1827 publication, Sketches the Ancient History of the Six Nations, that shares a number of stories between it and the Book of Mormon. And so I examine that in considerable detail. So this is a way we can actually listen to indigenous peoples telling their own stories and rethink how Mormons tell stories about indigenous people. And again, there's a preview of that available from Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. It came out in winter 2025. It's called Why Does the Night? The Book of Mormon's Misappropriation of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. It turns out that this whole idea of Jesus appearing in ancient America was not original to Mormons. There's an indigenous history behind it. The peacemaker in Haudenosaunee oral traditions started the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of 5 nations that would later be joined by 6. Those 5 nations I have on my shirt here: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca. The Book of Mormon came from the Seneca territory near a Seneca village of Gananoque and another called Ganondagan. You can go visit Ganondagan today when you're out in Palmyra, Manchester area.
It sounds like Gimgimna or Gimgimno. Do you remember those Book of Mormon names?
Oh, yeah. Interesting.
I just thought I'd mention it.
Yeah. But you can go visit this site. And interestingly about Ganondagan is that this was a site that was destroyed by the French in the 17th century. And they left behind lots of steel swords and, metal artifacts, evidence of horses. All these anachronisms that appear in the Book of Mormon were scattered around the Gananoque Valley and where Joseph Smith was hunting for treasure. So anyway, you can see that at Dialogue. I do an author's reading of the article. I did it in collaboration with—
That was you. I saw that option at the top, and I started playing a little, but I didn't want to listen. I wanted to read, but that's you reading it.
Yeah, so I read. Not the one on Dialogue. The one on Dialogue on their website is an AI. The one that's on my YouTube channel, which is at Dr. T.W. Murphy, that had 12 full subscribers before today. Hopefully we can
get it up to 13.
Oh, good. You can visit my website or Latter Daily Digest. It's at both places. And you can hear me read the article. And if people like that, maybe I will do some more.
I did put up the link. We don't have anybody in here yet, but I did want to just show something. I put a comment in the chat a little bit ago. RFM, you mentioned the indiscernible from a fraud, and Thomas, like you hit the nail on the head with this DNA issue. I just wish the believer could stand back and just recognize, here's what I put. I put, not only has and they're spelled wrong. But not only has their DNA disappeared, their writings have disappeared, their animals have disappeared, their plants have disappeared, their currency has disappeared, and their weapons have disappeared. And when you recognize that, when you take all of that away, it's almost like they never existed.
Yeah.
That's haunting.
Well, I mean, even the Book of Mormon says, as if the dead could speak.
Yeah.
As if the dead could speak.
Yeah.
This is
And
the confessions in the Book of Mormon itself. I talk a lot about that in the book. So,
and I would just want people to recognize, like, as you pointed out, genetic drift and all, like, yes, in some strange universe where you give so many allowances and so many turns of bad luck, sure. But notice how the apologist has to do that for every one of those issues. Why we don't find the animals. Well, maybe a horse was a taper. Maybe it's some other animal and Joseph's just, he doesn't know what to do with the word. Why have their writings disappear? Well, there's some other lower level of literacy that we do find exists. Well, it doesn't explain it. Well, okay. Their swords don't exist. Well, maybe those rusted. It's always this maybe, what if, God works in mysterious ways, if we just give some allowances. And when you do that so many times, you stretch you stretch the credulity of people being able to go like, that's just irrational. I can't stretch myself on 100 different issues when each one of them requires me to take something less than the most rational answer.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I call them the uninformed saints.
Yeah.
But by the way, so while we're getting people to line up in the show, 3 people with questions, we'll have time for 3 people to enter the studio. Hopefully you're doing that now. I just wanted to go to that last clip where they actually say, and by the way, this is in the context of they're critiquing the Heartlanders, of which none of them are because they're too smart for that. So they're critiquing the Heartlanders and the X2A mitochondrial DNA on Kennewick Man. But in the process, they say Ugo and this other guy, the 2 brainiacs, the ones who are so smart, they refute that as well. They nuke that from space as well. So what we have is an entire hemisphere, an entire Western hemisphere without one shred or iota of Middle Eastern DNA before Columbus.
But like sometimes the discourse on this gets unpleasant, I guess we'll say, and people who feel very passionate about haplogroup X have said some unkind things about Ugo in the past and stuff. But I want to stress, Ugo and John are both like full believing Latter-day Saints. They absolutely believe the Book of Mormon is true. They believe there are real Nephites and Lamanites. They believe it's a real historical record that testifies of Jesus Christ. Like, they believe this. They really do. And they would love it if some scrap of DNA were to come forth that could support the Book of Mormon. Like, they would probably be the first ones to champion that. Like, they are not they're very good, very talented DNA scientists, but they're also full believers, and so they have no motive. They aren't motivated to dismiss credible evidence for the Book of Mormon.
And it's not a conspiracy because it might go against their preferred geography theory, which, as far as I understand, neither of them have committed to a geography particular theory.
Yeah, they have a chapter on Book of Mormon geography where they're totally neutral on that.
Yeah.
They just say, here's the different theories or whatever. But yeah, they know the science probably better than any other Latter-day Saints, and they're just being honest about it.
Yeah.
And
we want to use the best arguments.
And you don't want to build up basically a false hope to people by building a scaffolding, an awesome theory for how the Book of Mormon is true, based on things that, like, just under the slightest scrutiny falls apart. So you got to be honest with what the science is saying, and Ugo and John are both very good with that.
So
there we go.
Irony alert there for young Stephen Smoot.
Yeah.
About the bad arguments. But there's no more fight. Yeah. It's over. The battle is over. There's no DNA. And at the very end, Neil Rappley is going to say, and I don't think there's ever going to be anything found. Mm-hmm. He agrees. So what the heck are we doing? Except making ridiculous excuses for why the Book of Mormon is proven not true by DNA science.
I would suspect that Stephen would go, we're never going to find any swords either. And we're never going to find Nephite writing either. We're never going to find those things. And I wonder why.
Because this book of Mormon exists in a vacuum. There are no other books like it. There's nothing contemporaneous. So
Yeah.
Well, there is in the 19th century. There is in
the 19th century. You're right. I'm sorry. I was talking about during the time the Book of Mormon represents itself as having been written. But yeah, 19th century, absolutely.
Yeah.
Everything is gone as if it never existed. All right, let's get Chad on here. I bet he has a question. Chad, how are you doing?
I'm good. Can you guys hear me good?
I can hear you fine.
Okay. So I have a lot of things I'd want to say, but I'll keep my thoughts, direct the question to Dr. Murphy. I guess the question that I would ask is, if I were to place you in the churches, you have control over what the church can do, what it can say, how it can write some of the, because I think there are some wrongs that are being done, right? Some erasure of the indigenous people's actual culture. What would be the thing that you would think should be done to address this?
Excellent question. I don't have that authority, right?
Right. Yeah. I'm just curious.
Right.
What would you say is the thing what would make this right?
And so, well, this is where my approach has been to listen to Indigenous Mormons and what they're saying, and so that's what I think should be done. And some of the messages that I'm hearing from Indigenous Mormons is that and non-Mormons, I should say, not just Indigenous Mormons. We should listen to non-Mormons as well. Non-Mormons are saying that the Book of Mormon is culturally appropriated from the Iroquois, and that the Iroquois have the original, I argue in my book, I think is a greater witness. So I think that this is kind of what I think was going on. I think Joseph Smith observed in his settler society a kind of the emergence of this Enlightenment world where there was a loss of spiritual abilities, where miracles no longer happened, where the enchantment of the universe was declining in this secularization of society. Okay. And Joseph Smith saw in native practices a world in which the miraculous was possible, in which people had visions and they had dreams, and they had revelations, and there were prophets, and they were producing their own scriptures. They were producing alternative scriptures to counter to the Bible, saying we have our own sacred narratives too. And I think he was seeing that that power in indigenous communities and trying to capture and replicate it. So when he's taking that seer stone that he believes is an indigenous artifact, and in fact, Haudenosaunee did collect exotic stones and use them for divinatory purposes, he takes it and puts it into his hat and stares into his hat. And he has visions. Well, if you read the earliest accounts coming from an interview of his father about the process, he describes it as putting the stone under a skin. Well, placing objects under a skin for divination purposes was the exact technique used by the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake, who a generation earlier had founded the Longhouse religion of the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois, not too far away from Palmyra, New York. And so I think Joseph Smith was actually trying to replicate the indigenous practices without understanding them. So when he produces dictates a text, imitating these practices, he's doing things that Native people don't think can happen. They yes, they have dreams and visions, they have revelations, but they don't produce historical texts that way. What happens in Haudenosaunee tradition with dreams and visions is that there is a cultural expectation, almost a psychological necessity to deal with the symbolism that comes from those dreams, because those dreams are like insight into your interior mind. They're insight into what is ailing you. And so you need to act out symbolically or in the actual world what you dream about. And that process is guided by in the interpretation of clan mothers, the Gantawisas that I write about in this book, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. And these Gantawisas guide the process of how to interpret dreams and visions. And so what I think needs to happen is that we need to reconnect with those clan mothers. We need to reconnect with Haudenosaunee communities. And I'm doing this in my work, I should say, and hear their versions of what's going on. And if David Cusick's book actually was a catalyst for Joseph Smith, then we can actually go back to read what David Cusick had to say for himself. We can read what Haudenosaunee scholars are saying today. We can have conversations with them. We can sit down with faith keepers and discuss that. And we've got a great opportunity to do it because Hiawatha Institute has, which is a new Indigenous university that has a partnership with Syracuse University right now. They have purchased the property of Wells College, which is about an hour from Palmyra, New York, in Aurora, New York. And they are starting the Hiawatha Institute there. They would like myself and other scholars of Mormonism to sit down with the faith keepers, the followers of Handsome Lake, and talk about this stuff and learn from each other. That's what I think should happen. But it shouldn't be me alone as a scholar. It should be other Indigenous scholars. It should be even church leaders should participate in that process and learn from the people who had the greater witness, to put it in the Book of Mormon terms, because their understandings are a lot more sophisticated than Joseph Smith's was.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Murphy, I guess the thing that I'd want to say to that is, before tonight, I would have just seen Joseph Smith's and the Book of Mormon's, I guess, tale of who the indigenous people were to be just a fabricated, this is not the history at all, and very much a story of erasing what the actual history was and just supplanting it with, now you have, what I said happened in the Book of Mormon. And that is still the case. There's stories in the Book of Mormon that definitely did not happen and are not the history of these people. But I think the interesting thing that you brought to light here is it tells that there are little nuances of the actual history of indigenous people that are mirrored in the way that Joseph wrote it, which I think that's interesting. And that's, yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. And I would say it's like the approach that I think Joseph Smith was using with Haudenosaunee oral tradition, or maybe David Cusick's book, if he actually read it, is that he was echoing and alluding to these stories in the way that he was with the Bible. So, but maybe not so many direct quotes, although there are some things that are pretty close to a direct quote. It's hard to know if it's a direct quote, if it's oral tradition, like you can with the Bible. But there are not just direct quotes in the from the Bible. There are also a lot of echoes and allusions to the biblical texts, and I think that's what he's doing with Haudenosaunee traditions. So when you see sibling rivalry between Laman and Nephi opening the Book of Mormon, that is an echo, an allusion to Flint and Sapling, who are the twin creators of the Haudenosaunee tradition. And even the Book of Mormon text itself notes that Laman was likened unto flint. And Flint is the character that resembles Laman in Haudenosaunee oral tradition. So you have these references. You also have references in the Book of Mormon to Oneida as a place name. Oneida was one of those 5 nations, and events that took place at Oneida that are described in the Book of Mormon during the 18th, actually occurred there during the 18th century. But the Book of Mormon gives the characters new names. Sometimes it's the same name, like King Noah or King Benjamin, or the same names. But other times he uses different names, but has these characters acting in similar ways with this battle between freemen and kingmen in the Book of Mormon. That's replicating the Revolutionary War as it took place across the Iroquois, but in a little more of an exaggerated form, a little more miraculous, a little more spectacular. But it is based on real events.
By the way, I just looked this up while you were talking because that is interesting, Professor. It's from, at least one is from 2 Nephi chapter 5, talking about the Lamanites. For behold, they had hardened their hearts against him, that they had become like unto a flint.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually the same passage that's so objectionable.
Right.
One of the
right.
worst. Wherefore, it goes on, wherefore, as they were white and exceedingly fair and delightsome, that they might not be enticing unto my people, therefore the Lord God did cause the skin of blackness to come upon them. It's the very first sentence of that verse.
And there's a pattern there, okay? So every time I was finding these echoes and allusions, there's also a whitening or a blackening in this case, right? And so that they're patterned together. So he's making these echoes and allusions, and then he is reassuring the white people that theirs is the better way. And so I think he's trying to negotiate between a settler and an indigenous worldview that reassures settlers of their preeminence, but also claiming a level of indigeneity for settlers by stealing these stories. And the Haudenosaunee oral traditions say they either shared these stories with him or they were stolen from him, but they very much recognize that these are their stories, or at least references to their stories, not the exact.
Okay, Tom, I got to bring this up. Okay. I was not going to, but now I'm going to. You may recall I did an entire episode on Chief Mitiga. I think his other name's David Taylor, but Chief Mitiga. And he proposes, he's a proponent of the idea that there are Native American elements in the Book of Mormon, but that they are there miraculously. And in my research, I remember this. He specifically suggested and then discounted the possibility that Joseph Smith got it directly from Native Americans in his area and then put it in the Book of Mormon. What do you make of that?
Well, he never talked to Haudenosaunee peoples about that. And in fact, you know, his chief grandmother that he had on some of his shows, Sherry, she was just interviewed by Dr. Chris Blythe in his Dr. Blythe's Lost Library. And she actually tells that she grew up near the Tuscarora Reservation and knew Mad Bear Anderson. Mad Bear Anderson, I talk a lot about in my books, this Tuscarora activist who widely spread these stories about Joseph Smith being influenced by Seneca followers of Handsome Lake. So he certainly should be aware of these Seneca stories because some of his followers knew the people spreading them. But apparently he either discounts them or is unaware of them.
Who knows? By the way, forgive my smiling. It was when you mentioned Chris Smythe. Yeah. We've had a little to do with Christopher Smythe, and it was not entirely unpleasant.
Yeah.
Why?
I'm sorry. I don't want to get into those. I know. You know, what I will say is I'm one of those people that I speak to all sides, right?
Mhm.
I consider you a friend. I consider Chris a friend. I consider
Oh, so now it's not a compliment anymore that you consider me a friend.
I think I consider our friendship a little closer. Certainly our
Thank you.
views
I
are
do
more
too.
aligned. But I was interviewed for his upcoming series. So you may see some discussion, some cameos from me in those appearances.
Is he still wearing the hat?
Yes, he is.
Okay. Some guys look good in hats, like Bill. Bill looks great in a hat on Friday nights. Mwah. Others, not so much.
Yeah, but I'm the guy that I went and presented my DNA research at the Community of Christ. I presented it at Ex-Mormon Foundation. I've presented my newer work at BYU. I've presented DNA work to creationists in Seattle, and I'll have a conversation with most anybody.
And lucky for us, I must say. Well, thank you so much, Chad. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah.
We'll let you get back to sleep there. Hope you're doing well. Really.
Thank you, Chad.
Bye-bye.
Help is just a call away. Okay. Talk to you later, Chad. Bye-bye. Anyway, Tom, thank you so much for coming on the show. Do you have anything that you want to say in conclusion before we send you packing and say goodnight to the folks?
I do want to reiterate the importance of listening to Indigenous people tell their own stories. And so it's not enough to buy my book. I really think that you should get at least Boxer's book. You should follow the work of Angelo Baca. You should follow that of Xander Sturgill. You should, check out essays on American Indian and Mormon history and decolonizing Mormonism, and hear Indigenous voices directly and not as filtered through me. And thank you, Bill and RFM, for the opportunity to be here, and go Seahawks.
Absolutely. Go Hawks. Welcome to the Hawk side. Good night, Professor Murphy. Thank you so much again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
So, Bill, here, let me go ahead and you did that. That's fine. I'm used to you taking care of everything. I think you've sort of been enabling of me.
Yeah, I wouldn't be the first time in my life I've been accused of being an enabler. So
Really? Okay.
that's not real.
No, it's not.
No.
Anyway, everybody, tomorrow night, I am doing something special. It's going to be Thursday night. And if you're not busy watching Porch Time, maybe you could come on over here. We're going to be releasing an RFM show. It's going to be 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. And it's in its initial stages. I'm just putting this together. Got a number of great people who are going to be on the panel. This is going to be live. I've decided this is going to be live. And we've got me. Bill can't make it. And that's the problem. That's actually why I'm bringing this up, because who knows what's going to happen with the tech tomorrow night when I'm in charge. And it's going to be live. So it's going to be so much fun. Colby's going to be here. Should I just say Colby Reddish? Everybody knows him just as the rando. Rebecca Biblioteca is going to be joining us, and so is Randy Bell. And I've got a couple other invites out there, and we'll see if anybody picks up on that. But the whole point of this is, and the reason we're doing it live and so soon, is because we're going to consider the first public address of Dallin H. Oaks as president of the church, which happened yesterday at BYU down there in Provo. So we're going to go over that. There are a number of things that he said that were of some interest and certainly comment worthy. And we're going to give it a whack tomorrow night, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, live on Radio Free Mormon.
That should be a ton of fun.
I'm just sorry you can't be there.
No, but it'll be fun anyway. Maybe more fun. But I'll just say there was a lot of things said in that talk that I think need discussion. And so I will have to catch up with it later, but I'll give it a listen because I think it's a big deal.
I think it's going to be wonderful. And then Friday night, please join us. By the way, it'll be Thursday night for Radio Free Mormon, so I won't have a Saturday night show. We'll just go live with it on Thursday and Saturday. Happy Valentine's Day to you. But Friday's going to be Mormonism After Dark at 8 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time. And then Monday, please join us again for the Mormon Newscast at 6 o'clock p.m. Mountain Time. After that will be Mormonism Live again. And then I'm flying down to Utah, down to your neck of the woods, Bill. What's up with that?
Look at that. St. George Thrive. You and I presenting Saturday night. And this should be a lot of fun. There's 680 people registered. They've got 50 tickets left, something like that.
That's Saturday, the 20. What is it? It's a week from this weekend.
Yeah, it's going to be Friday the 20th and Saturday the 21st. And you and I present on the 21st.
Okay, so I got plenty of time to come up with something good.
Yeah, you got to. We're going to have to do that.
Seriously, though, we had a nice talk the other day on the phone, and we decided what it is we'll be talking about. We have an hour, so we're going to divide it up 15, 15, 15, 50, and we all know what we're talking about, the right general subject. We're going to be fantastic. Don't worry. Just be there, and don't go into the karaoke until we're done, because apparently we're competing with the karaoke. Is that right, Bill?
We're competing against karaoke. Actually, I think maybe karaoke is competing with us.
Yeah. You got this all wrong. You're not locked in here with me. No, I'm not locked in here with you. You're locked in here with me. Well, I screwed that up, but
that's
what happens when you have live shows. You can't do retakes.
So,
name the movie. Name the character. Anybody know what I was trying to do there? And please join us tomorrow night for Radio Free Mormon, 6:30. It's a special time and it's a special show. And we'll see you then. Thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you to Professor Thomas Murphy. And thanks to everybody watching. Please hit like, please hit subscribe, please hit donate. If you haven't, go to Mormonism live.org and hit that donate button. You'll feel so good when you do. I know I do when you do. So thanks a lot. Good night, everybody. And we'll see you tomorrow night.